It is good to be here tonight. And so, if you would go ahead and turn to 1 John, we're going to be in chapter 3. We're actually going to start in chapter 2, verse 28. And we'll get to that in a minute. I want to draw your attention to this little nifty logo of Camp Ivydale. In a couple of weeks, we are going to be having the Ivydale Challenge over Labor Day weekend. And you might be thinking, if you're new, what is the Ivydale Challenge? And that's for our teens. And our young people do a great job of living up to the expectations that the world or our society places on them. And many years ago, way back in college, I had to read a book called The 7 Laws of the Learner. And one of those laws is the law of expectation. And that law simply states that if it is a reasonable expectation, most everybody will rise to that expectation and meet it. And so I'm of the belief that our young people can do so much more. And we need to be raising the expectation, raising the bar, if you will, for them. And so this Ivydale Challenge has that in mind. So a couple of years ago, we started this, and the whole focus was on worship. How do we worship? Why do we worship? When do we worship? And Chase Akins, who also does our worship when we're up there, came and did all those lessons and did a fantastic job with that and challenging our teens to engage in worship. There is a spiritual benefit to that when we do that as individuals. And an element that he brought too, that Chase brought, is also learning new songs that is carried through the years. I say that like we've been doing it forever, but the past 3 years. And we've been learning new songs that also we have the opportunity to learn a couple of those here. Last year, Jake Collins did a masterful job with how do we lean into our faith when life throws us a curveball? What does that look like? How do we develop our faith and grow in our faith so that when those things happen, whatever they may be, we can lean into our faith and work through those things. This year, a young man by the name of Matthew Height, I say young, he's 25. He's younger than me, so he's a young man. Matthew Height is coming and is going to be doing this theme right here, We Are Witnesses. And in Isaiah 43 and 44, that phrase is found a couple of different times. But God is speaking to His people, and He's saying, you have seen me do all these things. And because you've seen me do them, you are my witnesses. And so for our teens, we want to challenge them to open their eyes and see how God is working in their own lives, how God is working in the lives of their family, how God is working in the lives of their church family. And because of that, we are witnesses to that, and we need to be going out and sharing those things. And so that is the challenge for this year. Plus, we'll be learning some new songs. And so a challenge to our congregation. One of the things that we do is on Labor Day, before we pack up and leave, after we pack up, we present all the songs that we've learned. And we do that in a concert choir format. And so if you don't have anything going on at 10:30 Monday morning on Labor Day, come up to Ivydale and you get to hear those songs. What's really neat about that is an opportunity. So when all the parents come up and everything, they get to sit down and listen to what our teens have worked on throughout the course of the weekend. But it allows so many more people than just our chaperones and our adults that are up there to hear the songs and then to be able to say, I think we can do that at our congregation. And so I know Caldwell and Boise, Crosstower, Idaho Falls have been picking up these songs and have been singing them in their own regular worship times. And they become staples at camp too. And so, again, 10:30, I challenge you to be there. How'd you like that? All right, let's get into the lesson. We're going to be talking about this topic right here, children of God. And last Sunday, we were going over this. This was our Sunday school lesson. And I told our teens, I said, just be careful because you might hear all of this again. And so here we are. They're going to hear it all again. And if I miss something, let me know, and I'll go back and I'll capture it. So children of God, this is going to be in 1 John, and we're going to start in verse 28. We'll get to those verses here in a second. School has started for all of our teens. In high school and definitely in college, when you step into the classroom that first day, what is it that you get? Starts with an S and it ends in illibus. Oh, you guys you're on top of it. Yes, a syllabus, right? And so you get this syllabus laying out what is going to happen in that class over the course of the semester, or if it's a year-long class, over the course of a year. You're going to get that syllabus. It's going to go over the deadlines. It's going to go over the expectations, how you're going to be graded, how each project is going to be weighted in that grade. And also in that syllabus, you might have some things called a rubric. Fancy word that I didn't learn until after college. And so that rubric deals specifically with like those papers that you have to do or the projects that you have to do. And it lays out what needs to be contained in that paper or what that project needs to have in it in order to receive a certain type of grade. If you have those items, then your grade is going to reflect that. If you don't have those items, guess what? Your grade is going to reflect that. A well-written rubric is one of those things that it keeps the students from being confused, and it also helps the teacher to say, or the professor to say, listen, this is what you were supposed to do, and you didn't do that. And so a well-written rubric is really good. And so when we think about this from the standpoint of God's Word, maybe not to oversimplify it, but to oversimplify it, this is our syllabus. And within it, there's a lot of different rubrics that we have that help us out. So I think of the middle chapters of Luke 15, it escapes me, 12 or 13, the cost of discipleship. Jesus talks about what that looks like. What is the cost of discipleship? And we can read through that and see and understand, like, hey, this is what it means to follow Jesus. I also think of Galatians chapter 5, the fruits of the Spirit. If you're walking in step with the Spirit, then the fruit of the Spirit are the characteristics that should be evident in one's life if they're walking by the Spirit, correct? And so that's that rubric that we see. Here it is, and if you see those, then you know that person's walking by the Spirit. But if they're not walking by the Spirit, Paul lays that out too and says, this is the characteristics of the world, and this is what it's going to look like if you're walking in step with the world. Okay, so a rubric. So here in 1 John chapter 2 and 3, we have this title. My title heading is Children of God. And so John here provides a rubric for us to follow in terms of what it means and what it looks like to be a child of God. And so we're going to work through this and make some comments and have about 8 different things. And so it's all going to be on the screen here. Okay, so let's start. And now, little children, this is verse 28 of chapter 2. And now, little children, abide in Him, so that when He appears, we may have confidence and not shrink from Him in shame at His coming. If you know that He is righteous, you may be sure that everyone who practices righteousness has been born of Him. So there's a couple things here that we can point to, that we can add to a rubric here. The first one is that we have to abide in Him. If we are not abiding in God, then we will not be considered a child of God. And you'll see that in the language coming up when we get into chapter 3. The other one is those who practice righteousness. When we practice righteousness, the text there tells me that I have been born of Him. And that's important. That's an important point here, that if I am doing that, then I'm also born of Him. And so let's look at our rubric here. See that? That's fancy. So the first one, abide in Him. The second one, practice righteousness, is born of Him. Now I have born of Him in parentheses because you're going to see later on, practice righteousness is going to pop up again, but it's going to refer to something different. And so I want to make sure that we make that distinction here. All right? Okay, so chapter 3. See what kind of love the Father has given us, that we should be called children of God. And so we are. The reason why the world does not know us is that He did not know Him. And so here's what John is doing here before we really get into the meat of the text, is that he is setting up a compare and contrast. And so the compare and contrast here is that you have the children of God compared to or contrasted with those who do not know Him or those who are of the world. Okay? And so all through this text, we're going to have this, it'll be nuanced here and there, but this idea of if you're a child of God, this is what it looks like. And if you're not a child of God, well, then this is what it looks like. And we see that here, that last sentence, the reason why the world does not know us as children of God is because they don't know who God is. And so we're going to start seeing this comparison between the world and God, and between the people of the world and the children of God. Okay, so keep that in the front of your minds as we continue to work through this. Verse 2, Beloved, we are God's children now, and what we will be has not yet appeared. But we know that when He appears, we shall be like Him, because we shall see Him as He is. And everyone who thus hopes in Him purifies himself as He is pure. Now, there's something here that's taking place, and if you look at your Bibles, if you're following along your Bibles, you're going to want to be open there, because I'm going to bounce back and forth here a little bit. So in verse 28 of chapter 2, that when we abide in Him, so that when He appears, we may have confidence and not shrink from Him in shame at His coming. If we are abiding in God, when Jesus comes again, we're not going to be ashamed or anything like that. We're not going to shrink away and be fearful. Instead, we're going to have confidence because we know who Jesus is. And so then when you get to this verse, verse 2, Beloved, we are God's children now, and what we will be is not yet appeared. We don't know what that's going to look like, but it's okay, because we know that when He appears, we're going to be like Him. And so we have that hope, and because we shall see Him as He is. And so when we're abiding in God, when Jesus comes back again, we're not going to have to wonder like, well, what's He going to look like? What are we going to look like? Because it's not going to matter, because in that instant, we're going to know. And it's going to be okay. And so because of that, when we get to verse 3, everyone who thus hopes in Him purifies himself as He is pure. So that's another point that we can add to our rubric, right? So if we go to our rubric, we add that right there. Purifies himself. I'm using the text here. Okay, that if we were to apply that to us today, we could say purify everyone. Purify oneself, okay? So I'm saying that because I'm not excluding the ladies here. I'm just using the text. All right. Here we go. Verse 4. Everyone who makes a practice of sinning also practices lawlessness. Sin is lawlessness. You know that He appeared in order to take away sins, and in Him there is no sin. No one who abides in Him keeps on sinning. No one who keeps on sinning has either seen Him or known Him. And so we have a couple of more points here that we can add to our rubric. This first one is everyone who makes a practice of sinning also practices lawlessness. And so if we're going to, again, here's that comparison. If we're going to be children of God, we're not going to be practicing sin. Okay? But if we are not born of God, if we are not abiding in God, then we're going to be practicing sin and therefore practicing lawlessness. Because sin is lawlessness. That is there for sin, and lawlessness is like sin is equal to lawlessness. You know, sin, we use that definition for sin is to miss the mark, right? Which is true. If you're aiming at a target and you miss the mark, well, you've messed up. Same thing with us as Christians. If we sin, we've missed the mark. Here's our target, here's our goal, and if we don't hit it, well, we've messed up. John gives us a great definition here of what sin is. Sin is without law. Sin is lawlessness. Okay? And so then we can bracket all of verse 6, which powerful statements there. No one who abides in Him keeps on sinning. If we're abiding in God, we're not going to be sinning. But if we keep on sinning, it's because we have neither seen God or we don't know who He is. And if you go back and look at verse 28 and also verse 2, you see that knowing God versus not knowing God, that language that's there. All right, so let's go back to our rubric. Let's add our next point. So a child of God is one who does not practice sin. Pretty simple, right? So far, so good? It's not as hard as it looks. It's not going to be. We're not going to have a test on it until Jesus comes again. But that's important because we're going to want to make sure we get this right. All right. Next verse. Verses 7 and 8. Little children, let no one deceive you. Whoever practices righteousness is righteous, as he is righteous. Whoever makes a practice of sinning is of the devil, for the devil has been sinning from the beginning. The reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the works of the devil. All right, so when we look at these two verses, let's draw out some of those other points to add to our rubric. The first one is this: let no one deceive you. A child of God is one who is not easily deceived. And so that's important to add to our rubric and understanding what that may or may not look like, okay? The other thing is those who are children of God practices righteousness. And so when we practice righteousness, the text there tells me that I am righteous. Pretty simple. If I'm going to be practicing righteousness, then that is going to play into this idea of what righteousness is for me, and I am going to be found righteous. So let's go to got ahead of myself. Verse 8, I put that in parentheses again, but I wanted to distinguish it. This all goes back to the other point of do not sin. And so he's making, again, a comparison and compare and contrast here, the idea of one who practices righteousness and one who practices sin. And if you're practicing sin, then who are you a part of? It's okay to say this out loud. You're a part of the devil, right? That's what the text tells me there. But if I'm practicing righteousness, then I'm going to be a child of God. Okay? So, let's add this to our rubric. The first one is not deceived. A child of God is not easily deceived. The second point that we want to add from those verses, which will be number 6, is practice righteousness. And so there again, here in this verse, it's that idea that if I'm practicing righteousness, then I am righteous. Okay? Whereas in verse 29 or verse 28, verse 29 of chapter 2, practicing righteousness means that I'm born of Him. Okay, so that right living that we need to be a part of. Okay, let's go on to the next verses here, 9 and 10. No one born of God makes a practice of sinning. For God's seed abides in him, and he cannot keep on sinning because he has been born of God. By this it is evident who are the children of God. And so now John starts to wrap up this rubric, if you want to keep that in mind, and he's saying, look at all these points before. And if we know who the children of God are, if they are doing those things. Okay? And so he's wrapping this up. And who are the children of the devil? By this it is evident who are the children of God and who are the children of the devil. That compare and contrast again. Whoever does not practice righteousness is not of God, nor is the one who does not love his brother. I like that last one. It's like, oh yeah, don't forget this part. It's as if John threw that in right at the end. But that's an important element in John's letter here, loving one another and loving your brother. And he equates that on the level of, if you're practicing righteousness, then you are of God. But it's not enough just to practice righteousness. You also have to love your brothers and sisters. Okay, so a couple of points to add to our rubric. The first one is no one born of God makes a practice of sinning. That whole idea again. Okay, and then if we're practicing righteousness, we are born of God, and we cannot sin because of that fact that we are born of God. And then the last point that we want to pull out here is that we have to love our brother. So let's add those things to our rubric. The first one being born of God. A child of God is one who is born of God. And then the last one, a child of God is one who loves his brother. Okay? So when I look at this text, there's a lot there. There's 8 things. And those are things that I've pulled out in working with the teens last week, some of the things that they said as we worked through that text. You might think, hey, well, there's this that we could add to that. There's this that we could add to that. And that this is not the end-all, be-all list, is what I'm trying to say. But I think we can ask, when we consider this whole rubric, we can sum it up with this one question. What are you practicing? How many times is the word practice, and I'm using the ESV, how many times is the word practice used in those verses? Just aiming high. If you said 7, you would have been correct. 7 times. So when we look at that, it's used 7 times, and each time, 3 times, let me say it like this, 3 times it's in reference to righteousness. The other 4 times it's in reference to sinning. So let's look at that. Have your Bibles open, because this isn't going to be on the screen. Verse 29. If you know that He is righteous, you may be sure that everyone who practices righteousness has been born of Him. And then verse 7, with regards to righteousness. Little children, let no one deceive you. Whoever practices righteousness is righteous, as He is righteous. Because that's who we're trying to imitate, right? We're trying to imitate the Son of God, and if He is righteous, then if I'm practicing righteousness, then I am also imitating Christ. Okay? And then the last one, verse 10, whoever does not practice righteousness is not of God. So this idea that we have to be in the constant mind of thinking, yeah, we'll just move on from that. That has to be at the front of our minds all the time, that we have to be practicing righteousness, especially if we want to be a child of God. Because the text is very clear here, whoever does not practice righteousness is not of God. There is 0 wiggle room when it comes to that. 0. And so we have to make sure that we are practicing righteousness. Now let's consider it in terms of practicing sin. Verse 4 of chapter 3. Everyone who makes a practice of sinning also practices lawlessness. You're not going to be righteous if you're practicing sin. I wanted to get a cup and have a cup of water with oil in it. Because those two things don't mix, right? And you would see how it separates out. The oil goes where? Does it float on top? Yeah. And then the water's on the bottom, correct? And you can see, if you were to do that, you could use vegetable oil or motor oil. You would see that the water's on bottom and the oil's on top. The idea there is that oil and water do not mix. Righteousness and sinning do not mix. Okay? All right, let's go on. Verse 8. Whoever makes a practice of sinning is what? Is of the devil. Okay, whoever does not practice righteousness is not of God. Whoever practices sinning, well, they are of the devil. John is not mincing words here. And what I like about John is that when it comes to this letter, John is probably quite a bit older in age. And you see that when he refers to his audience as little children or dear children. You see that in 2 John and 3 John. And so he's talking with a great deal of care to his audience, but he's being very direct. And he's not mincing words. If you practice sin, you're of the devil. If you practice righteousness, well, then you are of God. You can't have both. Verse 9. No one born of God makes a practice of sinning, for God's seed abides in him, and he cannot keep on sinning because he has been born of God. And so this rubric can be summed up with this one question: what are you practicing? I underlined all those words in this text for me, just as a reminder, and then I put that question in my margin: what are you practicing? Made me think of the medical profession. or being in law. They say practice medicine, right? Or they say practice law. A lawyer is one who practices law, or a doctor is one who practices medicine. And so I was thinking of that, and I had to look it up, and I also talked with Kevin Campbell over here, who's a doctor, and I said, tell me about this practice medicine. And it was a great conversation that I had with Kevin. And in that, the idea is they say it's practicing medicine because medicine is always advancing. And with new research and new medical practices and improvements, they are practicing and continuing to learn and continuing to improve. Make sense? How come we never say we practice Christianity? Or we practice church? See, we have this mindset that we have to have it all right and do it right, but we're learning too, aren't we? As we continue to grow in our knowledge of the truth and grow and mature as individuals, as children of God, and I'm continuing to make those adjustments as I learn more about His Word and what He wants me to do, isn't that a practicing Christian? And so maybe another way we could sum this up is asking this question: are you a practicing Christian? If there is anything that we can do for you tonight, maybe it's you want to put on Christ in baptism and be that practicing Christian. Or maybe you just need encouragement from the congregation. You want prayers and support. We can help with that as well. Whatever it may be, would you come as we stand and sing?